Welcome back to the Be and Become podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Bitton. Today, I'm joined by a phenomenal culture and DEIV expert. She is an emerging leader, powerful leader. She's also the senior manager of culture development and communications over at 1Password. Thank you so much for being here, Kate Ryan. How are you today? How's everything going?
Things are good. Thank you for having me. We are here by the grace of the internet gods at the moment. So we are taking our moment. But for some reason, it's been an interesting internet day, but I'm great. And I'm so happy to be chatting with you.
I'm so happy that you're here. So, just to give everybody a little bit of context, so I actually met Kate Ryan when she was a panelist speaker at the HR and Tech Crawl. And I really was just drawn by Kate's dedication to really advocate for people first cultures, especially in such a high tech AI driven panel. And I loved her emphasis on storytelling, her emphasis on keeping, people operations done by people for the people. And so that really, really resonated with me. And I just had to reach out to her and invite her on the show. And she's been nice enough to join us. So for those who are listening, Kate, why don't you just share a little bit about your background? Because I know that you have a very interesting background. I know that you come from a different foundation that
Hmm.
has really given you some really unique insights into the work you're doing now. So tell our listeners a little bit about you and how you became such a sought after leader in this space.
Thank you. That's very kind. Yes, I actually, taking it even further back, was once upon a time an actor. So my background is very different than what I'm doing right now. But professionally, kind of like in the corporate world, I did start my career in sales and marketing. So I actually started in sales. I was a BDR, really learned the power of kind of listening to, the customer. What problem are we trying to solve? Focused on that. Realized very quickly I was not going to succeed in a career in sales, but I pivoted into marketing. The company that I was working at the time, I kind of took a chance on me. The VP of communications said, I think you're a good writer and would love to have you on my team. And the niche that needed to be filled at the time was employer brand. They were looking for somebody to redo their careers page. They wanted someone to kind of up their life at Instagram. And I realized that it was really cool to market a culture and not a commodity. And that was kind of my first foray into culture work. I got into internal communications at that company. I was really just the most junior member of a team, soaking up everything that I could. And, fast forward almost 10 years down the road now, I have, kind of built this career, which has seen me more now on the people side of the business, but comes from this foundation really of storytelling. And whether that's internal or external, I think it's a really interesting challenge to find the best way to bring people along for whatever journey you're on as a company.
I love that. I love that. We talk a lot about on this podcast, and we've had some other guests as well. And it reminds me of a conversation we had about really ensuring that people are very clear and
Mhm.
transparent about
Yeah,
what their culture actually is and how it
totally.
actually plays out on a day-to-day practice. Because we talk about culture all the time. We hear about culture. We understand now that HR professionals and recruiters alike are really making sure that their staff not only is a fit for skills and experience that seems to be such an archaic way of fitting in young professionals like some of the ones
Yeah.
that I work with. It's all about making sure that they're aligned with the culture. And I want to know a little bit just from your background and your experience, what is culture to you?
Mhm.
And what is it, how does that play out in the storytelling of a brand and of their people?
Yeah, good question. I think culture has been this abstract, intangible that we have referenced for so many years. And I'm sure like you and I can remember like everything when I started in the working world, when I got started in the corporate world in sales, it was about culture fit. So I actually
Mhm.
remember going on like, a culture fit interview with potential teammates. And I mean, it was all very driven, I think, by this kind of like, do you like this person? Do you want to work with this person? And then we kind of have swung the pendulum into like culture add. So,
Mhm.
are people, adding something to the culture? Are we thinking about the ways that they will challenge us? Are we, being honest with them about what they're going to get when they're here? And I feel like we've now kind of found what I believe is a good middle ground of, yes, we want to add people to our culture who are going to challenge us, who are going to push us forward, who are going to grow the culture, but we also have to be honest. And I think we spent many years, especially in the pre-pandemic era, of like, ping pong tables and beer and the office culture that everyone was, so obsessed with. And then COVID hit and that changed and culture became remote work and how are we fostering community? But to me, it's remained this intangible concept. And I think what companies are having to do now is actually get very clear on what they mean by culture. What does, culture to me is not just your values that you wrote and that are on the wall, but what are your, kind of mandates of your company in its current stage of growth? What is the company's goal at this stage of growth? Those influence what the culture is. Are you in a moment of like extremely high growth? Are you in a moment of stasis? Are you a massive corporation that is actually very status quo? I think all these things contribute to culture, which to me is just whatever phase your company is at with the people you have in that moment. And
Mhm.
what have you arrived at together? Whether it's, not hustle, intensity. Is it a moment of push? Is it actually a moment of pullback? I
Hmm.
think being really clear with people is actually a bit of a gift because we've spent so long with the fluffy marketing language of, we want every single person to be here, everybody could be a culture ad where like we at 1Password have actually started to say, like we may not be for everybody. That's okay. Like, right now we're actually really focused on X, Y, and Z. And if that sounds super exciting to you, we want to hear from you. But it's also okay if like a current stage of growth at any company doesn't sound super exciting to people. So I think culture sugarcoating is something we're seeing less of, but culture reality and, clear is kind, as Brene Brown says,
Mhm.
getting clear and treating that as something that should be spoken about upfront is actually like what we are looking to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I definitely see kind of both sides. Like, for
Mhm.
example, I mentor and coach a lot of young professionals getting
Yep.
into their industries. And what I find is really interesting about this new generation is it used to just be that, we wanted to have a secure job to pay our, to take care of our families. And that was kind of like the older generation. But now I feel like as we get into, the Gen Zers and so on, really want to be with an agency or a company that they feel very much aligned to on almost like almost on a purpose level. Like we talk about purpose a lot on this podcast as well. And the idea is that when people feel like they're fulfilling their purpose or they're maximizing their potential, most of the time they actually are very resilient and they are able to kind of curb this hustle and grind burnout culture that I know a lot of them are really afraid of.
Yeah.
What are you seeing on your at 1Password in terms of, how do we actually kind of walk the talk of our culture? How do we make sure that, like you said, it's not just values on the wall? Because there are still a lot of companies where they think that as long as I have it in my boilerplate, that should be clear enough type of thing.
Yeah, for sure. I think we've gotten just very focused, as I said, on clarity. I think that the clearer we can be about the current stage that we are in as a company, which is kind of a pivotal moment of growth and excitement, the better served we and our potential candidates will be versus, trying to be everything to everybody, which I think that we all know like companies have tried in the past and it doesn't quite work. Like, it's okay to say, this is what we're looking for. And, if that's you, come join us. We're excited. I think we as a company, we're much bigger than we were when I first started. We've really seen some incredible growth. I've been here 4 years in January, but, we've been really focused on, I think, creating a set of values and a culture that puts people at the center, but also encompasses that definition to mean like our customers and the collective good and people more broadly. And, especially in this AI evolution, how are we thinking about the impact on the collective people, not just, individual one, two, and three, but keeping humans at the center of decision making and of these things that, we're seeing evolve really rapidly.
Hmm.
And we have to now put as part of our culture. Companies now have to think about that in a really different way.
Hmm. in terms of scaling, so there seems to be
Mm,
this find that I find the most kind of unique, distinguished cultures are usually like these great startups where
mhm.
everybody is, you know, an individual, and there's a lot of emphasis on like autonomy
Yes.
and freedom of thought and creativity and having that kind of agile sort of culture. Do
Mhm.
you find that challenges come up when you start to take those values and kind of scale them out as you grow?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are just inherent phases of kind of the evolution of your company values. I think that values at a company mean one thing when you're 100 people, they mean something different at 500, and they mean something really different when you're 5,000 people. And I think that it's okay as a company to constantly be looking at those values and say, what do these mean today? Where are we at with our values, with their current state, with what they look like as we're growing and evolving. And to bring it back to storytelling, bring your people along for the journey with you. Find that committee of people that needs to be involved if you do feel some tweaks need to be made. Like, how can you define things for where you're at? I think that what we often see, and as you're referring to, is like these really talked about culture. We think about Facebook when it was starting. I mean, all these huge tech companies now that really set this tone when they were smaller, and then they've scaled far greater than companies, size that I've worked for. But then you see what happens as it scales. You inevitably have so many more people who are a part of that. There's going to be new interpretations, there's going
Mhm.
to be new ways of leading. How are your values serving you for where you're at? And how's your wider culture evolving? I think so much of that has to do with how you're storytelling to your employees
Mhm.
and your candidates. And, like my kind of like background and where my heart will always be is in that employer brand piece. But I think employer brand is internal and external.
Mhm.
You have to turn your employees into brand advocates who want to
Definitely.
talk about what they're seeing and what they're living at work and what they feel supports them in order for it to be authentic externally. And I think that you can only do that by like getting pretty clear from the get-go at whatever phase you're in and, leading with honesty and being transparent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, honesty and transparency is key. It seems like the kind of value that's always been in the corporate.
Mhm.
It's like, I mean, I know that when corporations first came out, it was always very, people were very skeptical about the corporation and, will they really care about us when we're just
Totally.
a number and that sort of
Totally.
thing. And we kind of went through that sort of hustle and grind, but it was a different kind of hustle and grind. It was more like, can we really trust this corporation to be in our best interest? So I remember that honesty and transparency was always part of the to kind of
Mhm.
silence those concerns. How do you think culture protects people in terms of their well-being? Because I know that, for example, like even in the event that we met at, I
Yeah.
understand, and I'm in the kind of tech space as well, and I understand that tech really, really values high performance. And I feel like
Yes.
sometimes our standards for high performance and sort of compassionate people first
Mm.
cultures might be at a dissonance with each other.
Yeah.
How do you find that apply when it comes to companies that are like, "No, we are in a growth period. We do need our people to perform really well." Do you find that there are challenges that come up in terms of retaining their well-being or
Mm.
retaining their dedication to the culture that was first set out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be tricky. I think that I mean, we at 1Password have certainly been in a moment this year of really getting clear with people on, on high performance and on the honesty that we feel like it's going to take to kind of take this company to the next level and having people that are all in, which is something that
Mhm.
our CEO talks a lot about. I think that they can be at odds, but I also think that it is on your internal storytellers and on your leaders to help people understand that, you know, high performing individuals want to work at high performing companies.
Mhm.
And, we want to be surrounded by people who push us to do better. That doesn't mean we want to be surrounded by people that are pushing us to our extremes and to burnout, but we want to be all in on something and on a collective mission that invigorates us. And I think when you
Mhm.
feel invigorated by that, you are motivated, you are excited. But there is also a responsibility, I think, on the company and on the individual and on leaders to ensure that that never comes at the cost of,
Mhm.
mental health and well-being. And I think we've been very clear at 1Password that, like the way we take care of our employees is not going away. You have PTO for a reason, work with your leaders. We always want to ensure people have flexibility in their weeks and in their work days. We're all adults. And I think that reminding people that like they have the autonomy to decide, are you in this right now? It is an intense moment. Intensity doesn't last forever. There's something really exciting on the other side. And we're really excited about that. I think, again, it's so much about the way you tell the story. And I think, we have seen examples of companies in the world where they just double down on like the work of it all
Mhm.
versus the excitement and the motivation behind the work. Why are we asking people to work so hard? What
Mhm.
is this moment that we can be excited about and get people bought into? So much of that is around the story that you tell. And I think companies do a disservice to themselves when they focus more on what they're looking for from output
Mhm.
and less on, this is what we actually see we could do together. What do you think? Like, ask your teams, ask your leaders, what's your interpretation? And also, here's what you get in return. This is what we as a company are committed to. Here's how we're supporting you. And I think that, again, it's just like, what are you saying to people? Like, how are you bringing them along for the journey? I know I'm like harkening back to this again and again, but it's kind of where my passion lies, clearly.
It sounds like a company needs a lot of foresight for that, though. Like, I feel
Yeah.
like I feel like at some point, like, I mean, in order to really say like, "Hey, this is where we're headed. This is where we'd like our story to unfold in the
Yep.
next quarter or so," they really do need to know what that is supposed to look like. Do you think that that is a challenge for is that something that is on the like, on the side of, say, professionals in your space that are responsible for that kind of communication?
Mhm.
Or is it executive leadership? We talk a lot about that in our podcast where it's like, who's really responsible for this, this storytelling piece?
Mhm. Mhm.
And how is that responsibility, distributed? And if there's any kind of holes
Yep.
in that storytelling process.
Well, I mean, I think there always has to be a top-down approach to owning the communication in a company. I think without senior leaders on side, it often is not, just doesn't resonate. People wanna know that the leaders believe in the message that's being sent to the company. I
Mhm.
do think that it's a hugely important investment and responsibility to make sure you have communications professionals who are able to support companies and senior leadership teams who are doing this. I'm very fortunate to work with them on our marketing side. We have incredible corporate internal communications leads who partner with us on the people side of things to make sure our messages are, coming out in the right way. We're cascading things in the right way. And to your point about foresight, I think it does require foresight to be able to tell a story of how we'd like it to unfold this way. But I also think there is a layer of, being vulnerable with like, this is where we'd like to get to. This is where we're at today. So this is our hope and our company mission and vision, and this is what we're doing. But this is what we see on the path to that. And I think every company can write their own path, no matter what stage of growth they're at. It requires foresight, but it doesn't necessarily require a 5-year plan.
Hmm.
It just requires, I think, bringing people along to whatever you're in, whether that's trying to get people, motivated about the end of the quarter or that's getting them motivated about the end of the year, whatever it might be. I think that there's foresight, but there's also just the importance of communications, whether the story is fully baked out or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely have a strong passion for storytelling myself. I used to be a journalist actually, so stories are always a big thing for me.
Yeah,
I love that actually. I love that both of us have this kind of brand background because branding is always about storytelling and how we're representing ourselves. And I think that it's a really great avenue to kind of get into this people first conversation because
totally.
we understand, what people want to hear and resonate with and, how they move and what they're expecting and what lights them up. And I think all of that insight really plays a huge role in building out these policies.
Totally.
Is there any kind of new challenges that you're noticing on the ground at 1Password or just across the board? anything with regards to performance. I understand that there's been a big hit on engagement. I've been hearing that engagement has been a big challenge in this space. Do you see any other kind of unique challenges that maybe you haven't seen or didn't see when you first started in this work? Is there anything new that you're noticing?
Well, I mean, I think the backdrop of the world is very challenging. I think more so than anything that's happening in a company's microcosm, I think the macro situation that we are up against, 5 years from the start of COVID, the landscapes that we're seeing right now are very difficult to navigate. I think there are groups of individuals and people who feel scared and, how are we as on the people side of the business and, the HR realm taking care of employees in, new ways. Our CPO is always very quick to talk about, like being in HR now is very different than it was 20 years ago.
Hmm.
And I think the expectations of a company and of, what people are looking for from their employers, especially in a post-COVID landscape, is very different. It's very different generationally. It's very different because of what we've all lived through, because of the huge influence of remote work. And I think that, on the topic of engagement and high performance, I mean, these things play in, but I think the macro factors are so much bigger than the individual things that companies may be seeing.
Hmm.
And I think every company's feeling it, no matter how big they are, how small they are. We're in such a different landscape than we were in 2018, 2019. I think about even the work I was doing then on employer brand. I mean, it was very different. The expectations were very different. We were, throwing pizza parties on Fridays and talking about them on LinkedIn and like, companies are expected to show up very differently now. And I think it makes it very hard. It's very challenging. I think you have to take care of yourself when you are the people that are responsible for that mandate at a company. Take the time that you need, make sure that you're recharging yourself and filling your own cup because I
Hmm.
do think there's a lot of demands and just expectations of how we care for people in this current world, which makes it tough for sure.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and this is something we can't really avoid either, right? I mean, the world is always going to be happening outside
Absolutely.
of our workplace. And it is very true that we're also seeing the extra added pressure that a lot of people have, like a lot of stuff going outside of their
Totally.
job too. Like, with this notion of, well, we got to perform no matter what.
Mm,
And these kind of burnout cultures, like that's why I kind of got passionate myself, is because I was a high performer myself and
mm,
drove myself to burnout a few times as well. So there is that external pressure, that macro pressure, that micro
yeah.
pressure. And yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of different changes. The landscape is changing. Is there anything that you think, you know, HR teams need most, say, from, say, a subject matter expert or a well-being expert? Like, how can we support the HR teams that are really kind of having to, reevaluate what their role is
Mm,
in terms of employee well-being? How
yeah.
can we support HR as, consultants like myself or anyone?
Yeah.
What is the support that is needed in that is
Yeah.
needed most?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think it's like one that I probably can't answer on behalf of people, but I know for me, I mean, I spoke about this recently actually on another podcast, but I don't come from a traditional HR background, and I think that we are seeing people teams evolve a lot into kind of incorporating more skill sets that come from very different backgrounds. So whether that's somebody like me, whether that's like the evolution of DEI and people with a ton of different backgrounds coming in to support people teams and to support companies, communications professionals, learning and development, so many specialties now that go beyond very traditional routes of, HR business partners, recruiters, etc. I think that all those different groups need very different types of support. I think it totally
Mhm,
depends on what your mandate is within HR. I think there are the people that are helping employees, there are the people that are recruiting candidates who are having to potentially answer difficult questions. There are the people like my team who are responsible for telling stories to the company or training the company. I think everybody has very different needs for support, but I think a through line for everybody is I think remembering we're all people first. We're not employees first. We are people on the other side of that email.
mhm.
which might be a really tough one. It might be a tough phone call. It might be having to support employees through something that we ourselves may be going through. And I think having that empathy and putting people at the center of, I think just remembering like that's what we are. We are people first. And how are we keeping that in mind as we think about performance, as we think about engagement? There is a lot going on in the world that could be impacting people at work. How do we support, the whole employee? And, also remember we're business and, we absolutely have a mandate and we want to grow and we want to do all these things. But I think it really is just like supporting the people that are supporting the people, which
Yes,
is what HR teams
absolutely.
are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. I think that comes down to it the most. I think that performance and people need to coexist. People can't perform unless they do actually fully own their humanity.
Really.
And that's kind of like why like I say, that's actually why I really was drawn to you as a panelist because, we were all very excited to hear about how AI is making our lives easier. But is there a risk? Like I couldn't help it, but I was sitting in that chair listening to all of you and I was like, but is there a risk that we're losing our human touch? Is there a risk that we are focusing too much on, expediting this growth as much as possible. And we're kind of losing that human resonance that we need so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a risk in everything. I think that
Yeah.
inherently, no matter what we're implementing or experimenting with, I think there are always going to be questions about the newness of it. There are
Mm.
so many unanswered questions when it comes to AI and the implementation of it and how it's supporting people. I think it's about getting very clear, though, on what's the problem you're trying to solve. It's not about pushing out adoption for the sake of adoption. It's getting very clear, with your employees or your teams, whatever, kind of granularity level you're looking at. How could this help us? We are the decision makers, humans are at the center, but what are some of those rote tasks that we could automate? What are some of the things that could free up time so that we can build better relationships with candidates or what have you? I think that, yes, of course, there's risk, but it's up to a company to decide that like humans remain at the center of decision making. Comes to bringing on a new tool that hopefully helps with productivity, and freeing up time to do the work that matters.
This is my favorite part of your point that you had, and you had it at the panel too, which is that we need to actually use AI as not something that is a source for fear, but actually more a tool to actually give us more
Yeah.
room to be more
Yes.
human.
Yes.
And I absolutely love that. And I also want to also mention as well for the listeners of our podcast who most of the time are high performers,
For sure.
a big reminder to really celebrate your humanity. I actually do believe that not only does our work experience prime us for the most aligned and purposeful, fulfilling positions,
Yeah.
but also just our lived experience. And I
Totally.
love that DEIV experts like yourself are really embracing that. We're finally realizing that, diversity is our strength,
Yeah.
that the 360-degree human is the best performer and is the best culture add to
Yeah.
our business goals, especially, depending on what that phase of growth is for us.
Totally.
So this has been a phenomenal, we've covered so much. We've
I
covered so
know.
many different challenges. I know I had a lot of questions for you.
This was awesome.
And you've answered, you've been so amazing and so full of value and
And the
wisdom throughout this.
internet worked. It stayed.
And the internet worked. That's another thing I always talk about too, that like actually sometimes like failures and like bumps in the road and things like that actually kind of, makes us a little bit more grateful when things actually kind
Hey,
of move smoothly and we weren't
don't take the
expecting
small
it to.
things for granted. That's what I learned
That's
this
it.
afternoon. The internet.
That's exactly it. Exactly it. I love it. I absolutely love it.
It
Is
was
there anything
such a
that you want to share to our listeners, whether they are, some of them are HR professionals, some of them are leaders,
Mhm.
some of them are high performers, and some of them are also looking for jobs. Like some of them are just listening on and trying to hear from, those in the HR space and saying like, "Hey, like how can I find my best culture?" Is there any kind of words of wisdom that you would give to that group, the ones that do believe in people first cultures, the ones that
Mhm.
want to believe in themselves, want to believe in the companies that are doing good work,
Yeah.
any kind of final thoughts that came up for you as we close out?
Yeah, I think that putting your values at the center of what you're looking for, I think is really key. I think we always are reading, company careers pages and job descriptions, and we're scrolling LinkedIn and we're seeing how companies talk about themselves, but how do you talk about yourself? What are you actually defining yourself by? There's so many tools out there, strengths assessments, different things that can help you find that way to describe yourself and what you bring and what you stand for. And I think keeping that at the center of your job, your leadership, your job search, whatever phase you may be in your professional journey, I think remembering that, and that's something I learned like pretty late in my career. I did when I was young, I was like, yep, sounds good. I can be whatever they're saying they are. This is great. And I think really being clear with yourself, what are you looking for in a culture, And if you are reading something that doesn't align to you, that's okay, like it is totally okay. And I think just remembering that we are all, as you say, 360-degree individuals. And, what are you defining yourself as? And does that work for you in the current circumstance that you're in?
I absolutely love that, absolutely love that. Going full circle to our importance on
Really?
clarity. Clarity
Yeah.
is fine, honesty, transparency, it goes from the individual, it goes from the organization. We need to be very clear and proud of who we are and let our humanity flag fly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love it. I love it.
And it's just such an amazing thing to have you here, and we
Thank
really
you.
value having you and your wisdom and just so much of your, like, just a diverse background. You've so
Thank
much to
you.
share, and it's just been so great to have you.
Thank you.
And for those of you listening at home, definitely get in touch with Kate.
Please,
If there's
anytime.
anything, if there's any way, if you have any questions for her, you want to learn a little bit more about how to scale your communications, or if you want some assistance in terms of maybe you as an organization or as an individual really need assistance in telling your story in the most authentic and empowering way, that is aligned with your values and mission, both as an individual and as an organization, definitely get in touch with Kate. And that will close out the rest of our episode.
Thank
Thank you so much for
thank
being
you.
here.
Thanks,
And
Rebecca.
for those of you at home, keep being yourselves, keep becoming the best version of yourselves, and we'll see you on the next episode. Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
We did it.